These men might at first seem to be astronauts preparing for launch into space. In reality, they are modern-day spies. Pilots of the world's fastest and highest-flying aircraft, the SR-71. It is but one spy machine in America's vast intelligence network, which is always listening and watching, taking full measure of the world. This spy plane can fly higher than 80,000 feet, at over 3 times the speed of sound. It reportedly can outrun any plane or anti-aircraft missile in existence. The missions these pilots fly are secret, but they are reported to have ranged from detecting China's first atomic bomb explosion to surveillance of Nicaragua today. It is a practice repeated throughout history, using the view from the high ground to gain an edge over an enemy. A century ago in the Civil War, the Union Army tested hot air balloons and cameras for aerial reconnaissance, but dodging Confederate bullets made for blurred photography. The need for getting above the battlefield was never greater than in the trench warfare of World War I. The first solution was to once again march out the balloon, now elongated and finned for stability. But it was still an easy target, especially for another new invention in the sky, the airplane. The airplane became famous for aerial dogfights, but its first mission was reconnaissance. Many planes carried cameras. They were bulky, heavy, and sometimes held by hand. But the results proved worth the effort. Military planners called for more and more photos. By the war's end, millions of images. But it was not until World War II that aerial reconnaissance came to the forefront. One of those responsible for America's effort, retired General Elliott Roosevelt.
We were woefully lacking in the techniques of intelligence gathering. For instance, in my field, which was aerial reconnaissance, we went into the war with absolutely the crudest idea of aerial reconnaissance and what could be garnered in the way of information. We learned it all from the RAF and the British.
(1940), the battle for the skies of Great Britain. The British pilots were badly outnumbered, but they had a secret weapon, a technological breakthrough called radar. This electronic means of gathering intelligence revealed the precise location of incoming German planes. The British also had forewarning of many of Hitler's war plans thanks to cracking the secrets of the German Enigma machine. This machine encoded many German command messages that were thought unbreakable, but it was beaten by another machine, the newly invented computer. U.S. Navy codebreakers proved just as resourceful in the Pacific, painstakingly building a copy of a decoder they had never seen to duplicate Japanese codes. Magic, as it was called, yielded a rich harvest. By December 1941, American leaders had intelligence warning of a possible Japanese attack somewhere in the Pacific. On December 7th, a last-minute decoded message revealed that the Japanese were breaking off diplomatic relations, a sign that the attack was near. But Washington failed to alert military leaders in the Pacific in time. Pearl Harbor was America's greatest intelligence failure. But later, American leaders came to rely heavily on magic. Its information proved decisive in the carrier battles of Midway and Coral Sea. Some Allied military leaders credited the codebreakers with shortening World War II by at least a year. What did end the war was the atomic bomb. But as the war ended, relations between former allies grew cold. The Soviet Union was soon perceived as America's new enemy.
And we were incredibly ignorant about military events, especially within the Soviet Union. And there were two types of information the United States wanted to get. One was targeting information, information about military facilities in the Soviet Union that would be attacked in the case of war. The second was early warning information, being able to detect Soviet military moves that indicated an attack on Europe or the United States.
But Stalinist Russia was shrouded in secrecy. Obtaining information became a major effort of the newly created Central Intelligence Agency. Dino Brugioni, a World War II aerial photographer and one of the CIA's first employees.
One of my first jobs was to create files of industrial installations in the Soviet Union. So I became an expert in the Soviet Union, but having flown photography, I knew that the Germans had flown reconnaissance over the Soviet Union. So I managed to get a lot of that photography into the files.
In September 1949, a reconnaissance mission over the Sea of Japan brought back air samples containing evidence of radiation. The Soviets had exploded their first atomic bomb. America's nuclear monopoly was over. In the rush for more intelligence information, the CIA recruited photo specialist Arthur Lundahl.
And I said, now wait a minute, I don't know anything about you guys from CIA. If you think you're going to parachute me into Trieste or something like that, forget it, because I'm no 007.
Lundahl was asked not to jump from planes, but to supervise America's expanding photo interpretation effort. Most of the photos were taken from slow-moving planes of World War II vintage. During the next 10 years, more than 40 American aircraft and nearly 200 crew members were lost over or near Soviet-controlled territory.
There were aircraft missions, mostly U.S. Air Force, very brave men who skirted the Soviet Union, taking long-range oblique photography across the borders and then trying to get away before they were shot down. Sometimes they were shot down. The headlines were big. The major industries and things we were looking for were not along the borders, they were in inland. So it was not a satisfactory program. You had to get inside, deep, to find what we were after.
Desperate for information, the CIA resorted to a Civil War technique, using balloons. High-altitude skyhooks like these were sent aloft to drift across the Soviet Union, randomly taking pictures along the way. Most were shot down or lost. The few recovered brought meager results. Tensions heightened even more during the summer of 1953 when the Soviets exploded their first hydrogen bomb. President Eisenhower, worried over the threat of a thermonuclear Pearl Harbor, proposed open skies. Each country would be allowed to fly freely over the other for military reconnaissance.
No one wants another Pearl Harbor. This means that we must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world, especially those capable of massive surprise attack.
Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev rejected the proposal, calling it nothing more than a bad espionage plot.
George Kistiakowsky, the late George Kistiakowsky, President Eisenhower's science advisor, told me that we were dropping spies into the USSR, and in Kistiakowsky's words, they were being liquidated virtually as soon as they hit the ground. So it was very, very frustrating. Imagine being in 1954 and knowing that they've got nuclear weapons and that they say they're building all these things and not knowing for sure. So you have to know for sure. How are you going to know for sure? You're going to try and fly over them and look down and take pictures.
The spy machine to take those pictures was already being built, tucked away in a corner of Lockheed Aircraft, a corner called the Skunk Works. In overall charge of the program, the CIA's Richard Bissell.
We knew that we were going to need a secure location where flight test and development could take place. And we identified a location in Nevada that was perfect for aircraft operations, smooth as a billiard table.
The plane, called the U-2, was like no other aircraft built before. Part jet and part glider, It became the single greatest intelligence accomplishment of its time.
I think one of the great hidden stories since World War II has been the fact that intelligence has been enormously important in creating new forms of technology. The U-2 is a very good example. In the early 1950s, it was thought that you could not get a plane to fly above 70,000 feet. It was nearly impossible, or if it was possible, it would take practically 10 years to develop.
8 months after the go-ahead to build the plane, the U-2 was in the air, shattering altitude and distance records.
It was well described as a power glider. I can make the point by illustration. I was sitting in Washington one afternoon and received a telephone call to the effect that a U-2 on a training mission over the central United States, and specifically over Tennessee, had had a flameout at altitude. That is to say, the jet engine had ceased to function. The pilot was able to, had said he was going to glide back to New Mexico and land at Albuquerque, which is precisely what he did.
The plane's payload was a massive camera with a specially designed telescopic lens. A lens so powerful it could spot a golf ball from a height of 8 miles. New, thinner film allowed for thousands of photos to be taken. The U-2 could map the entire landmass of the United States in less than a dozen flights. The 4th of July, 1956, Wiesbaden, Germany. The U-2's first penetration of the Soviet Union, a daring overflight of Moscow and Leningrad.
I told Alan Dulles that the aircraft was airborne and where it was going. His reaction was exactly like your question. Is it really wise to go over the 2 largest cities and presumably most sensitive locations in Russia on the first flight? And I said, well, the first flight is almost certainly the safest flight there'll be.
Although beyond the range of Soviet surface-to-air missiles, the U-2 pilot was far from safe. The plane itself was full of traps and danger.
Well, you were asking a pilot to climb into a terribly cramped cockpit. He was deprived of food and water for up to 12 and 13 hours at times. He had to keep terribly close watch over a number of controls to keep this plane level. It takes, needless to say, a great degree of steady nerves.
Colonel Charles Stratton, pilot of the U-2 for 18 years.
We all accepted the fact that it certainly didn't have some of the very best equipment that a lot of our airplanes did. It didn't have backup systems for a lot of things. The early on airplanes didn't have ejection seats. It wasn't extremely difficult to fly as far as actually flying it was concerned, but you had to constantly be monitoring and paying attention to what it was doing. The stall was by far the worst situation to be in. You just flat could not stall it up there.
The first flight over Russia was a complete success. 4 more overflights in July put to rest fears in the United States that the Soviets had built a large fleet of bombers, then the only way to deliver nuclear weapons. But the bomber gap was soon replaced by another fear. Before the launching of Sputnik, the world's first satellite, Khrushchev had boasted that Russia would soon have a guided missile capable of delivering a hydrogen bomb anywhere in the world. With Sputnik in orbit, Khrushchev's boast became an ominous threat. Could that same technology deliver a nuclear strike against the U.S. in a matter of minutes?
Ike pays his first visit to the Missile Test Center at Cape Canaveral, a personal inspection by the nation's commander-in-chief of the mightiest hardware in our defense arsenal, at a time when public debate over America's preparedness is at a peak.
In the late 1950s, there was enormous pressure. We sometimes forget about it today, but enormous pressure on Dwight Eisenhower to spend almost wildly on defense. This was especially true after Sputnik, which put many Americans into a panic about alleged American inferiority against the Soviets.
Ike's comment after his 3¼ hour survey of what America is doing in the rocket and space race: it was a very worthwhile trip.
What the U-2 allowed Eisenhower to do was to say, privately, I know what the Soviets have. I know what they lack. I know that despite what Khrushchev is saying, they are not spending all that much on defense. Therefore, we do not need to spend as much as my critics are telling me we must.
The U-2 was now providing Eisenhower with more than 90% of America's intelligence on the Soviet Union. And what Eisenhower most feared, the U-2 had not found: an operational force of intercontinental nuclear missiles.
Some cases where we had literally pieced together bits of folklore, mapping, information, travelers' reports, say on a place like Tyura Tam. We would have stuck all these little bits of information on a map and made a great melange of things. And one look at the aerial photo of that place literally wiped out most of that folklore and gave us hard, crisp information that was measurable and reaffirmable by anybody who wanted to look at the pictures. It was really like seeing the dawn after a long, dark night of ignorance.
The U-2 had revealed the true nature of the Soviet missile and bomber threat. Yet, despite the importance of this intelligence, Eisenhower was more and more reluctant to fly into Soviet airspace.
Eisenhower, from the very beginning, perhaps as a military man, was very sensitive to the fact that one of the worst things you can do to another country is send a plane in without permission. This was especially true, needless to say, in the Soviet Union. Eisenhower said privately that if the Soviets did this to us, he would have to retaliate. It might start a nuclear war.
The Soviets had much to fear from the overflights. Besides unmasking Khrushchev's boasts, the U-2s were also providing the U.S. Air Force with traditional targeting information in the event of war. Eisenhower also knew the Soviets were coming closer and closer in their attempts to shoot down the plane. But he was assured by the CIA that should the flimsy aircraft be hit, the pilot would have no chance of surviving.
I think I told her that it probably would be fatal, as most of us thought. Now, there was publicity given to the fact that the pilots all carried a needle with which they could kill themselves quite painlessly and very quickly. But we were very, very explicit in briefing pilots that that was an individual decision and they were under no obligation of duty to do that.
In April 1960, U-2 photos like this one uncovered new activity at Tyuratam, the Soviet version of Cape Canaveral. What the photo showed was evidence that the first Soviet ICBM was being deployed. Eisenhower's concern over the missile outweighed his fear of a shoot-down. He approved one more mission over Soviet territory. The date, May 1st, the traditional Soviet holiday. The pilot was Francis Gary Powers. From northern Pakistan, Powers was to fly over 3 possible Soviet missile sites, landing some 4,000 miles later in Norway. But above the missile site of Sverdlovsk, the plane disappeared. Eisenhower, assuming Powers could not have survived a U-2 crash, dusted off a contingency cover story. The White House announced that the new space agency, NASA, had lost a high-altitude research plane. But Khrushchev had his own announcement to make.
On display in Moscow, the wreckage of pilot Francis Powers' U-2 reconnaissance plane for Muscovites and foreign newsmen to see as the Soviet launches its most belligerent anti-American propaganda barrage in recent years. Khrushchev himself at the Moscow press conference loosed a furious tirade, charging America with deliberate aggression and threatening to attack any Allied bases from which U-2 jets flew over Russia.
Political disaster followed at the Paris summit, where Eisenhower had hoped to discuss ways to prevent the arms race. Khrushchev demanded a public apology. Eisenhower refused. The summit collapsed. It would be the lowest point of Eisenhower's presidency. The spy plane had helped Eisenhower resist pressure for an arms buildup, but the U-2 incident was blamed for spoiling the first hope for international arms control. Powers was convicted of espionage and served 2 years in prison before being exchanged for a Soviet spy. His trial received enormous attention. But amidst the uproar, America's spy machines were taking their first steps into the sanctuary of space.
Discoverer 13 roars aloft from a California launching pad. It's lucky 13 because after 17 orbital passes around the Earth, the missile's payload, a data capsule, is dropped to Earth and recovered 330 miles from Hawaii. The first man-made object ever recovered from outer space. Ceremonies in the White House mark the historic feat.
Disguised as a scientific program, Discoverer's real mission was to spy on the Soviet Union. Again in charge, Richard Bissell.
A satellite has enormous area coverage compared with an aircraft. I think more important than that, this was the pioneer satellite reconnaissance venture.
The next mission, Discoverer 14, went fully according to plan. The capsule was snagged by a flying boxcar as it parachuted back to Earth. Soviet skies, closed to the U-2, were reopened by the satellite. But the U-2 would play still one more pivotal role in the most dangerous confrontation of the nuclear age.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba.
We were concerned with Cuba for a long, long time because lots of Soviet equipment was going in there. Obviously not going in there to defend the cane fields. It was going in there for some other purpose. What that purpose was, we didn't know.
A clue came from an arcane intelligence discipline, cratology, knowing how the Soviets crate their weapons for shipment. The next piece of the puzzle came from U-2 photos like this one. This was a surface-to-air missile site, laid out roughly in a Star of David configuration. This pattern had been seen before, inside the Soviet Union, protecting nuclear missiles.
And as we were flying the missions over Cuba, we could actually watch and monitor them construct a SAM-2 or an SA-2 site. They would scrape the ground, and very slowly you could see on subsequent missions over the same place that they would, the Star of David, which was the way they laid out the SA-2 sites, begin to take shape.
More flights were ordered. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 passed over San Cristobal and brought back unmistakable evidence of the unthinkable. Photos of nuclear missiles 90 miles from America's shores.
After I'd gone over about a dozen of these pictures with President Kennedy, this was on October the 16th, 1962, he asked many questions about the items in the pictures, and I defined each of them, where the nuclear warhead vans were parked behind the trees, where the missile transporters and erectors were arranged, and all of this military missile jargon.
Photo interpreters had worked with blurry images like these for years, but some untrained eyes inside the White House had doubts. The president's brother and close advisor, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, later admitted that he and others saw no signs of missiles in the U-2 photographs.
And the president heard it all, and then he turned in his chair and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, "Are you sure of this?" And I said, "Mr. President, I am as sure of this as a photo interpreter can be sure of anything."
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
Once again, the White House and the executive it shelters commands the interest of the world. Attention that's riveted on the signing by President Kennedy of a proclamation ordering a naval and air quarantine of Cuba. Action that follows the shocking discovery that Soviet Russia is converting the island into a ballistic missile base. Naturally, every unit of the U.S. Armed Services, led by the Air Force, is being advanced to a perfection of combat readiness. At every air base in the United States, planes of every type are ready to retaliate against any aggression.
Poised for war, the United States continued to fly reconnaissance missions over Cuba. Low-flying jets took photos like these, showing technicians frantically working to make their missile pads operational.
It was agreed that any surface-to-air missile site that was fired at one of our aircraft would be immediately destroyed. And there were combat aircraft standing by loaded with rockets and CBUs to take out those sites.
Nearly 2 weeks into the crisis, a U-2 flown by Air Force Major Rudolph Anderson was blown out of the sky by a surface-to-air missile. Unlike Powers, Anderson did not survive. But America's leaders, unsure of the pilot's fate, delayed issuing an order to retaliate.
In a sense, it was fortunate that it took a number of hours to determine whether Rudolph Anderson had hypoxia or whether he was shot down.
The downing of Anderson came as the crisis peaked, but the next day a diplomatic solution was reached. The Soviet Union publicly announced that the missiles would be withdrawn. In return, Kennedy secretly agreed to dismantle missile bases in Turkey. As the world pulled back from the brink of nuclear war, the same reconnaissance system that discovered the Cuban missiles recorded their removal. From this moment on, the U-2 and other spy machines would play two roles: the familiar one, uncovering and tracking nuclear weapons for the military, and the new assignment for diplomats of confirming arms control agreements, even those as informal as between Khrushchev and Kennedy.
People tend to forget that the backdrop for all this missiles and Cuba business was the fact that Kennedy knew that Khrushchev was lying, was bluffing when he said that they were turning out 250 ICBMs a year that could turn the United States into a ditch. The reconnaissance satellites, which did not play a part in the actual looking at missiles in Cuba, were looking for missiles in the USSR and not finding many. And in a strategic sense, that allowed Kennedy to back Khrushchev down. The Soviets, by the same token, also had reconnaissance satellites, and what their reconnaissance satellites brought back was unmistakable proof that F-100s were flying into bases in Florida, that the Navy was going into the Northern Caribbean, that Kennedy wasn't joking, that we were getting ready to do something seriously to get them out of there. Khrushchev backed down. Kennedy was able to win the hand because both sides were getting back unambiguous strategic reconnaissance data. And in that regard, it may have averted World War III.
A quarter of a century ago, America was ready to go to war to remove the threat of almost instant nuclear attack from missiles 90 miles away from its shores. Today, nuclear weapons may be stationed further away, but the atomic threat exists in far greater numbers. In 1962, missiles were measured in the hundreds. Now they number in the thousands. And the world is always no further than half an hour away from the possibility of nuclear destruction. With nuclear arsenals on hair-trigger alert, intelligence provided by a global network of spy machines on both sides helps to keep peace. By their capability to verify arms control agreements, spy machines provide one of the few stabilizing factors in the nuclear age.
Intelligence gathering started when the first balloon was flown with a camera on it, in order to gather information about the positions of the enemy so you can hit the enemy. It was in the context of combat. Verification, on the other hand, is in the context of negotiated agreements. You say, what happened? How did the use of the same technology change? It changed because you cannot resolve conflict with combat anymore. In the presence of nuclear weapons on both sides, combat is meaningless.
The first formal agreement came in 1963 with the signing of the Atmospheric Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty of 1972 limited the number of nuclear launchers each superpower could build. In 1978, Jimmy Carter, hoping to build support for the Second SALT Treaty, was the first president to officially confirm the existence of spy satellites.
Photo reconnaissance satellites have become an important stabilizing factor in world affairs, in the monitoring of arms control agreements. They make an immense...
In making this revelation, Carter hoped to assure the American people that SALT II was verifiable. This meant that the United States had the technical means to confirm that the Soviets were abiding by the terms of the agreement. This required being able to locate and count nuclear weapons, measure their power, size, and accuracy. One provision limited the size of rocket changes to 5%. That required spy machines capable of detecting missile variances as small as 6 inches from outer space.
I am confident that we can verify with extreme confidence the existing restrictions, including the restrictions of the SALT II treaty that is theoretically no longer in effect. But we know whether the Soviet Union has gone over any of those limits or sublimits. We can tell that.
But SALT II was never ratified by the U.S. Senate, although generally observed. Today, the controversy over verification and the suspicion that one side might cheat continues.
Somehow it's difficult for people to say that verification is impossible. They'd much rather say it's difficult, or very difficult, or extremely difficult. But sometimes it's simply impossible, and we ought to say that.
If you are inclined to believe that arms control is verifiable, you read the intelligence one way. If you are inclined to believe that the opposition is 58 feet tall and you'd better rearm or else, then you read it another way. And that's where it gets dicey, when you get into politics.
But both sides do agree that spy machines can provide only hard technical data. They cannot tell you the intentions of your enemy, so human spies will always be a part of this increasingly high-tech intelligence system. But their role is changing. Former CIA Director Stansfield Turner.
For instance, what you do with the human agent today is to fill the gaps in what you cannot obtain by technical devices. Why? If you were one of my agents, you wouldn't want me to risk your life for information that I could get virtually without risk from a satellite photograph, would you?
These spy satellites are operated by the National Reconnaissance Office, which is hidden inside the Pentagon. The NRO is so secret that its very existence is denied, but it spends billions of dollars on technical espionage. The U.S. Air Force Space Division, a public arm of NRO, refused Nova's request for an interview, but much information about spy machines is publicly available. One example is the Keyhole 9 satellite. First launched in the early 1970s, this one satellite could photograph the entire landmass of Eastern Europe and Asia every 3.5 hours. The KH-9 is believed to have carried infrared and television cameras, but its best imagery came from film, which had to be retrieved and processed, and this delayed timely information. This problem was solved by real-time digital imaging. A non-classified version of this technology is the Landsat satellite. The smallest object Landsat can see is about the size of a house, but even this resolution can reveal details about important events. These pictures are of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor.
What we have is the before and after the Chernobyl accident. During the accident, we had a reactor site that was hot, a building that was hot. We had no activity going on in the cooling pond at all whatsoever. Where before we had activity going on as usual, normal, we don't anymore. What we have here, what we'll do is the flicker back and forth. So you can see, notice the changes going on from the cool to the hot.
This is what allows satellites to make real-time pictures, an invention called a charge-coupled device. The images this device sees in orbit are converted into digits, numbers, and transmitted back to Earth.
There, the picture is being reproduced on a television screen, essentially. So as the camera is overflying Moscow or Sverdlovsk or Petropavlovsk, you can see what it is seeing in real time. Not only that, but if you see something interesting, you can order the lens to zoom so you can look even closer.
There's another way to zoom in on targets, using computers. This company, 3M Comtal, specializes in photo enhancement. Its technology is used by some of America's classified intelligence operations. This picture shows an airfield. Among the planes on the tarmac is a U-2. This is a digital image, as are many satellite photographs. By using a computer to manipulate the digits, this system can spy on the spy plane. The photo interpreter can zoom in on the plane, isolate it, and even sharpen the focus of the image.
What I'm going to do is come in on the U2 plane, which is up here in the top at the point. I can zoom in on this particular plane until I get to the desired area that I'm interested in and the desired zoom factor. So this gives me total interactive control, and I can zoom and move around anywhere in the image data, with still maintaining my reference point up here on the other screen.
This is another example of transforming numbers into images. Called LA the Movie, it was created by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, from a single two-dimensional Landsat photograph. The creator of LA the Movie, Kevin Hussey.
A satellite that looks straight down can actually give you pictures that look like you're standing 100 feet off the ground. Something that was 570 miles up, we can now process and get an idea of what it would look like to look at the scene from 100 feet or 1,000 feet from any angle of view. Given a two-dimensional data set, a satellite picture, let's say a Landsat picture, if we have elevation information for that, it can be derived from the Landsat picture itself. A geometric model can be constructed in the computer so that the final image, or the output image, the final product, will be a three-dimensional representation of what started as a two-dimensional scene.
This type of image manipulation has many possible intelligence and defense uses. B-1 bomber pilots could rehearse in simulators low-level bombing missions, becoming familiar with enemy terrain without ever going near it. For photo interpreters, seeing objects in 3 dimensions helps in identifying weapons, whether tanks or missiles, and determining their size and capabilities. These images, remember, are from a satellite that can distinguish objects no smaller than a house. Imagine if the images were from a spy satellite with a resolution of a few inches. America's current spy in space, the KH-11, reportedly has just that capability, all in real time.
The KH-11 was known as a real-time satellite. So a picture could be on the President or the Secretary of Defense's desk within a matter of hours rather than in days or weeks as with the other satellites. And that was a rather major improvement in U.S. capabilities, particularly if you think of monitoring a fast-breaking crisis like the Middle East War or the Iran-Iraq War.
No U.S. satellite pictures have ever been officially released, but this one was purportedly taken by a KH-11 from a distance of 500 miles in space. The photograph shows the Soviets' first full-size nuclear-powered aircraft carrier under construction on the Black Sea. Objects as small as 1 foot are distinguishable in the photo, although it is impossible to reproduce this detail on television. These photographs were originally published by a British defense magazine. A U.S. Navy analyst was convicted under the Espionage Act for providing them. But the French-owned Spot Image Corporation sells satellite imagery for profit. Here, anyone can buy pictures of any country in the world. Spot's resolution is about 30 feet. In this case, the pictures are of a controversial radar defense installation near Krasnoyarsk in central Siberia. Some critics argue that it is part of a Soviet defense system that violates the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Whether for verifying arms control treaties or for strictly military intelligence, imaging satellites are not enough. For spies, hearing is as important as seeing. The National Security Agency has developed methods to constantly eavesdrop on communications around the world.
Sometimes that's a very small antenna, and you try to sneak it in. Sometimes it's a very large antenna that you openly place in your own territory. Sometimes the signal you're intercepting is very small, narrow, limited range, and getting your antenna there is going to be very difficult. I mean, under Mr. Gorbachev's bed is hard to get to, for instance.
You don't necessarily have to place a bug on a telephone in the Kremlin to pick up a particular conversation. If that person in the Kremlin is speaking to the Far East, Soviet Far East, to Vladivostok, say, is going by microwave, and those microwaves travel in a straight line, and that straight line of a microwave eventually terminates in space.
Those microwaves are gathered by the United States with large umbrella-shaped satellites called Rhyolite, Magnum, and Chalet. These satellites sweep up thousands of electronic signals, everything from ordinary telephone calls to perhaps the most important intelligence of all, telemetry. Electronic data transmitted from a missile about its technical performance during a test flight.
So when you're testing a new missile, that's the type of information you'd like to get. The designers of the missile would like to get that information, but the other fellows' intelligence community would also like to get that information. It can tell you how advanced the missile's design is. It might tell you something about its vulnerabilities. And you can also use that information to monitor compliance with an arms control agreement.
When an actual missile is going to be tested, the first thing you do is not see it, you hear it. Because telephone calls have got to be made, communications have got to take place in preparation for this. Somebody's got to say, Ivan, press the button, or get ready to press the button. And then you alert your system. And the system is redundant. It's in space, it's around the USSR, it's on land, it is at sea.
While the missile is still on the pad, the KH-11 sends back live pictures. During launch, the missile sends telemetry back to its ground controllers. This data is also picked up by Rhyolite-class satellites and ground monitoring stations. These listening posts ring the Soviet Union. There are reports that the U.S. even has listening bases inside China. As the rocket reaches the Pacific and heads for splashdown, the missile and its payload are tracked by radar, ships, and spy planes called RC-135s. The RC-135s are similar in appearance to passenger jets. On September 1st, 1983, a Korean Airlines civilian jet was, according to one theory, mistaken for an RC-135. Off course over Soviet territory, it was shot down by a Russian interceptor, killing all 269 passengers and crew. Out of countless recorded Soviet transmissions, America's spy system was able to isolate the voice of the MiG pilot who shot down the KAL airliner.
ZG, missile warheads locked on. I've executed the launch. The target is destroyed.
The KAL incident provided the world with a vivid demonstration of America's eavesdropping capability. But if America's network of spy machines is to reduce international tensions, it must have a counterpart. But just how good is the Soviet reconnaissance system?
We fly Cadillacs, they fly Chevys. They're very reactive. We have got very highly sophisticated, large reconnaissance satellites with lots of miniaturized stuff in them that do lots of exotic things. They're not quite as exotic, but they send up a lot of them. In September of 1985, they had 10 reconnaissance satellites in orbit at the same time. Their weakness is they're not as good in computers as we are, and that hurts them a bit.
The Soviets use their Soyuz spacecraft for science and space exploration and reconnaissance. It's widely believed that cosmonauts conduct spy missions. The Soviets also use an unmanned version of the Soyuz for reconnaissance missions. The orbital module, instead of returning cosmonauts, brings back surveillance photos. But for gathering missile data, the Soviet Union relies less on spying from space than does the United States.
in collecting telemetry from missile tests. They can use surface ships that are driving around out in the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean, since our missiles are tested over the ocean. We can't do that, since Soviet usually tests their missiles over the Soviet interior, where even aircraft can't get at them. So they can simply load up a ship with electronics to collect information on our missile tests. We have to develop a very sophisticated satellite to collect similar information.
As sophisticated and extensive as America's intelligence system is, it faces many problems. With tens of thousands of images and messages recorded daily, are human analysts drowning in information?
Well, the problem has always been that the United States, particularly the NSA, doesn't have any problem collecting information. They have incinerators that are designed to burn 40 tons of paper a day, for example. So collecting data, collecting information has never been a problem. The problem has been analyzing that information once you collect it.
It's hard to say. No researcher, which is an intelligence analyst, ever would want to tell you that he's got too much information, because they always want that one more clue that they may find is the most valuable one. And that's where the computer comes in, and we just couldn't handle this without computers.
A civilian application of computer techniques to combat the flood of images is seen at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Here, technicians compare pictures of the same site taken at different times. But in reality, it is the computer that first detects the changes. Comparing masses of digitized images is just one of the spy tasks assigned to supercomputers. This machine can perform over 150 million calculations per second. The National Security Agency reportedly has row after row of them. Besides information overload, another problem is that spy machines themselves are vulnerable to espionage. The Soviet Union may know more about U.S. satellites than American citizens do. Christopher Boyce gave away secrets of the Rhyolite satellite. William Campile sold the Soviets the technical manual for the KH-11 for $3,000. And Ronald Pelton compromised a host of NSA secrets, including the existence of a critical underwater listening device used in tracking Soviet subs.
7 feet per second, altitude 4.3.
But the most immediate problem facing America's spy system is a basic one: getting off the ground. In 1980, a secret U.S. defense study forewarned that a failure of the space shuttle could be disastrous for the entire technical intelligence collection effort. The Challenger tragedy grounded the next generation of imaging satellites, which are presently too large for unmanned rockets. Two other attempts to put into orbit what were believed to have been the last remaining KH-9 and 11 satellites failed.
As of right now, we have got one KH-11 in orbit, and that is getting close to the end of its useful life. They're being very careful how they use that satellite now. You don't just keep running it all the time. You've got to husband your satellite very carefully. They keep it up as high as they can to prevent atmospheric decay, and they don't work the system any more than they have to. So to that extent, it is in trouble. To the extent that the KH-12, is produced and ready to go, we will bounce back.
For the future, America will monitor weapons and arms control compliance with a yet-to-be-launched KH-12. Its existence is still officially denied. The KH-12 is believed to be similar in design and size to the space telescope illustrated here. But instead of pointing to the stars, the KH-12 will look back at the Earth. It is believed to possess a tremendous ability to spy down to a resolution of inches, as well as being able to see in the dark.
Meaning we'll be able to get decent, although not as good as usual daytime photography at nighttime, which means that if the Soviets are testing a missile at night or being involved in troop movements or anything else at night, then there'll be a possibility of getting those photographs.
For 3 decades, spy satellites have trained their lenses and antennas mainly on stationary missile pads. But now the missiles have started to move. The Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range missile carries 3 warheads, and its launcher can be reloaded quickly. The SS-20's mobility poses a challenge to treaty verification that will be intensified as the Soviets deploy their rail-mounted SS-X-24 long-range missile. Even more elusive is the American cruise missile. The cruise can be launched from land, air, or sea, carrying nuclear or conventional payloads. Though not a first-strike weapon, the cruise is considered the most difficult challenge for treaty verification.
Cruise missiles are very difficult, very, very difficult to verify complete ban or even testing. Cruise missiles presumably will have nuclear warheads on them. But then you can't tell whether this is a conventional one or a nuclear one. And the only way to avoid that confusion and uncertainty is to ban production of all of them, which I think the military will oppose with some reason. So I don't see a solution for the case of cruise missiles.
The cruise missile relies on a computerized mapping system. Information provided by satellite photography, much like that in L.A. the movie, assists in course corrections during flight. The result is pinpoint accuracy. In this test, a cruise missile carried a conventional warhead 240 miles to its target.
The guidance system of the cruise missile that we have now, the TERCOM system, depends on a very, very accurate mapping. And that indeed is another function of photo reconnaissance. So photo reconnaissance, like Jekyll and Hyde, it has peaceful applications, but also has very threatening applications. What you see here is exactly what we've been saying for a long time, namely that technology can be used any way we want to use it. The same technology, the same capabilities can be used to help combat and to help negotiated agreements with our opponents.
Throughout history, information gained from the high ground has been critical for warriors. It is now critical for peacemakers as well. As atomic arsenals continue to expand, any hope for arms reduction and the security it brings to our planet may rest in large measure with our spy machines. Yet it is no small irony that the machines that spy on nuclear weapons also are used as guidance systems to deliver those same weapons with deadly accuracy. The more capable reconnaissance systems become, the more accurate nuclear weapons can be. For today and the future, the missions of spy machines and weapons are intertwined, locked in a cycle of endless competition.
That's true. When the target becomes more difficult, like a small cruise missile is more difficult to detect than a great big intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM, you then have to start finding